Hey, this is Rick Kasalich, injury specialist from exercisesforinjuries.com. In today's video, I want to go through the top 4 hip joint pain relief exercises. And I'll get Donna-Lee to go through the first one, and I'll kind of help her a little bit, and then I'll kind of explain it, and then go through the other 3. Okay, so there you go. That ends up being the first one. It ends up being called a leg pull. So with hip joint pain, a lot of times what there ends up being is there ends up being a buildup of tension in the hip joint. And what we want to do is relieve some of that tension. And we do that by adding some traction or some pulling in that hip joint. Now, I'm not going to be around to pull on your leg. But what you'd end up doing is you'd look for loop tubing, and the loop tubing you can pretty much get at any department store and definitely at any fitness-specific store. It's loop tubing. It looks like this. If you've ever worked out in a CrossFit gym, they have them there, and most fitness centers have them as well. So you're taking the tubing, you've got it underneath your ankle, you're crossing it over your foot, and then what you end up having, this part is looped around something. So it can end up being like the couch or something secure that's not going to move. And then what you're going to do is Donna-Lee's going to lay down, and then she's going to kind of scooch up as much as she needs in order to kind of get the right amount of traction or pulling happening in that hip. And when she's lying down, she's going to relax and try to relax that hip and let the tubing kind of pull down on that hip and kind of create more space in that hip, ease the tension in that hip joint. Now, I recommend that you kind of decide how much tension or pulling is happening in that hip. I really don't advise for you to ask your partner or friend to yank on your hip. That's not a good idea. But you can take the tubing and then you can gradually change the pull that you're having and finding a comfortable level. And then what you want to do, like what Donna-Lee has done, you want to kind of check and see how it feels. Does it feel better? Does it feel looser? Is there more movement? Is there less hip joint pain? If that's yes, then go and do another repetition of it. If it ends up being worse, then step back, make sure you've done all the correct steps. Maybe you're having too much of a pull on it, need to decrease how much pull is happening on it. And if still you've done the exercise and you've gone back and you made sure you've done it correctly and still doesn't feel right, then discontinue the exercise. But when it comes to if it's worked for you, when it comes to sets, reps, time, and intensity, the sets I would end up doing 1. The repetitions you can do, I would start off with 1 to 3 repetitions. Time, start off with 10 seconds, but then you can progress to 30 seconds. And the intensity, you want a light pull happening in that hip joint. And it's not like you're trying to rip your leg out. You want to feel like a light stretch or light pull happening in that hip joint. So that's the first one, leg pull with tubing. Now we're going to move to the next one. And so Donna-Lee's going to have the loop tubing again, legs straight, and it's going to bring the other part of the loop tubing kind of in the front of the thigh. Okay, so now we're kind of doing the same thing. We're doing the traction again, the hips in a different position, the tubing's pulling down on her hip to kind of create more space, decrease the tension, loosen things up, stretch things in that hip joint in order to provide hip joint pain relief. Now, with this right now, there's not a ton of tension that Donna-Lee ends up having, but what you can end up doing is like adding a knot in the tubing, and that'll end up increasing the tension. Or once again, you can do as Donna-Lee and I had done before, you can end up looping this underneath something like a couch or something that's really secure. You can scooch yourself back until you're at that point where you're getting the right amount of pull in that hip, and that's providing hip joint pain relief to you. Good. Perfect. So with this one, just like the one before, you're looking at, when it comes to sets, reps, time and intensity. Sets, 1, repetitions, a couple repetitions, like 1 to 3 repetitions. Time, start off with 10 seconds, then progress to 30 seconds. And the intensity, we want a light stretch ending up happening in the hip. Now, moving on to the other 2 exercises. So we've gone through the top one, which would be the first one, and the second best one was the second one we went through. Now the third one, we're going to end up doing a press up. So Donnelly's going to go through it. Hands are at like shoulder height. She's in good alignment here. She's going to press up with her arms, arch through her back, arch up to the point that she can, and then come back down. Now with this one, it ends up doing a couple things, working on mobility in the spine, so improving the movement in the vertebrae, in the joints, in that low back area. And the reason why for that is a lot of times people end up having poor mobility in the low back, and that poor mobility forces parts of the body above and below that area to pick up the slack. And a lot of times the below area ends up picking up the slack, which ends up being the hip. So you want to improve the movement in that low back, which will end up helping when it comes to hip joint pain. Other thing we're working on is we're working on extension, like in the hip, like meaning bringing that leg back in the hip. And a lot of times with our sitting society, we end up losing that extension part because we end up sitting so much, so we're flexed or bent in that hip. So this ends up helping with that extension, stretching out of the front of the hip, and also working the mobility of the hip. Now with this one that Donnelly's doing, sets, reps, time, and intensity. Sets, 1, repetitions 5, time, smooth controlled movement with a good stop at each of the end and start positions, so a good 2 seconds. Intensity, light, because what we're looking at is mobility, either improving the movement in the joint, regaining that movement in the joint, and maybe a light stretch in the tissue around the joint. Perfect. So moving on to the fourth one, and this one ends up being in standing. So this ends up being a leg back, arm overhead stretch. So Donnelly's going to bring the right leg back, and then she's going to bring the right arm, there we go, right arm overhead. And with this, then what she ends up stretching is the front of the hip. Maybe I'll get you to switch sides. Maybe we go with the left leg back. There we go, so people can see it. Good. So now what's happening with this, we're working on that hip extension, which a lot of people end up losing, or they don't have, and that's end up leading to hip joint pain. Working on the extension, working on stretching the front of the hip and the hip flexor. Now adding the arm increases the intensity. So now we've got more of a stretch, and it might end up carrying into the spine and then further up as well. So with this one, when it comes to sets, reps, time, and intensity, sets 1, repetitions would be 2, and ideally I would alternate back and forth. Time, I want to hold the stretch for 20 seconds, and the intensity, we're looking at a stretch, so we're looking for a light stretch to get the most out of the stretch. Perfect, Donnelly. So there you go. That ends up being the top 4 hip joint pain relief exercises. Give those a go. Now, if you want some of my other tips and tricks when it relates to dealing and overcoming hip pain, then what I recommend you do is click right here. I have a brand new free report called 5 Tricks That Fight Hip Pain and Tightness. Just click right here. Let me know where to send that brand new free report, and I'll send you that brand new free report right away. Now, if you're watching this on a tablet, smartphone, a mobile device, head down below in the description and click the first link, which will end up being exercisesforinjuries.com/hips. Let me know where to send that report, and I'll send you that report right away. Now, if you got benefit from this video, make sure to like this video. If you have a question or comment for me, leave it down below in the comment section. And then lastly, hit subscribe in order to get future pain relieving videos.